When the DNA results came in, I thought it was a mistake. I sat at my kitchen table staring at the piece of paper, reading the same lines over and over, hoping the words would change if I just looked at them long enough. For 20 years, I had loved, fed, and protected a boy I called my son. I had packed his lunches, attended his soccer games, stayed up all night when he was sick, taught him to drive, helped him with homework, held him when he cried. But the paper said otherwise. Edward Johnson is not the biological father of Benjamin Carter. And what hurt most wasn't the lie itself. It was realizing my husband had built our entire marriage on one. That everything I thought I knew about our family, about Ben, about Edward, was based on a secret that had been buried for 2 decades. My name is Julia Marie Johnson. I'm 52 years old. I was married to Edward Johnson for 22 years before he died in a car accident 6 months ago. We met when I was 28 and he was 30. I was working as a teacher's aide at an elementary school. He was a police officer, handsome in that quiet, steady way that makes you feel safe just being around him. We met at a community picnic. He was working security. I was supervising the kids' games. He smiled at me across the playground, and I knew, just knew, that he was going to be important in my life. When we started dating, Edward was upfront about having a son. I have a 2-year-old, he told me on our third date. His name is Ben. His mother and I didn't work out. She left when he was a baby, said she couldn't handle motherhood. It's just me and him now. I appreciated his honesty. A lot of men would have hidden that, would have waited months before revealing they had a child, but Edward put it all out there from the beginning. If that's a deal breaker for you, I understand, but I need you to know that Ben comes first, always. I looked at this good, honest man who was brave enough to be vulnerable with me, and I said, I'd like to meet him. I fell in love with Ben before I fell in love with Edward. That little boy with the dark curly hair and the gap-toothed smile, he just grabbed my heart and didn't let go. Edward brought him to our fourth date, lunch at a park. Ben was shy at first, hiding behind his father's legs. But I pulled out some crayons and a coloring book I'd brought, and within minutes he was sitting beside me, showing me his picture of a dinosaur. That's a very good T-Rex, I told him seriously. You made his teeth very scary. Ben beamed, and Edward, watching us, smiled in a way that made my heart skip. We got married a year later. Small ceremony, just close family. Ben was the ring bearer. He took his job very seriously, walking down the aisle with a pillow clutched in his tiny hands, his face so focused and determined that the whole church was trying not to laugh. When we said our vows, I looked down at Ben standing beside Edward and I made a silent vow too. I would love this child as my own. I would never make him feel less than because he wasn't biologically mine. I would be his mother in every way that mattered. And I was. God, I was. For the next 20 years, I was Ben's mom. I was the one who kissed his scraped knees. I was the one who stayed up with him when he had nightmares. I was the one who taught him to read, helped him with fractions, talked him through his first heartbreak. Edward worked long hours as a police officer, overnight shifts, weekends, holidays. I didn't mind. I loved being home with Ben. We had a daughter together when Ben was 3, Grace, beautiful Grace with Edward's eyes and my stubbornness, and I raised them both the same. I never differentiated. Ben was my son just as much as Grace was my daughter. Ben called me mom, not stepmom, just mom. The first time he said it, he was 4 years old. We were at the grocery store and he wanted a cookie. Mom, can I have a cookie? Like it was the most natural thing in the world. I almost cried right there in the cereal aisle. Edward, standing beside us, squeezed my hand. You're his real mom, he whispered. The one who stayed. I believed him. I believed all of it, that I was Ben's mother, that Edward was his father, that we were a real family built on love rather than biology. There were odd things over the years, things I noticed but dismissed. Edward never wanted to talk about Ben's biological mother. She's in the past, he'd say whenever I brought her up. She didn't want to be part of his life, let's just leave it at that. I respected that. I figured it was painful for him, talking about the woman who'd abandoned their son. I never pushed, and Edward kept everything about Ben's early life locked away, literally. He had a safe in his office with papers he said were just police stuff and important documents. I never questioned it. Why would I? I trusted my husband completely. Ben grew up into an incredible young man. Smart, kind, funny. He was in his second year of college studying engineering when Edward died. The accident was sudden. A truck ran a red light, hit Edward's patrol car head on. He died at the scene. I got the call at work. A fellow officer came to tell me in person, which is how I knew immediately that it was bad. The worst. I don't remember much about the days after, just fragments. Ben coming home from school, Grace sobbing, the funeral, so many people in blue uniforms. The flag folded into a triangle and handed to me. The unbearable weight of grief? A week after the funeral, I started going through Edward's things. Not because I wanted to, because I had to. Bills needed to be paid, accounts needed to be closed, documents needed to be found. I opened his safe using the combination he'd written down years ago in case of emergency. Inside were the usual things: our marriage license, the kids' birth certificates, insurance papers, and an envelope, old, yellowed, with my name written on the front in Edward's handwriting. For Julia, if I'm gone. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a letter and a document. I read the letter first. Julia, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry. I'm so, so sorry. There's something I never had the courage to tell you. Something I've been hiding for our entire marriage. Please forgive me. Please understand that I did what I thought was right at the time, and by the time I realized I was wrong, it was too late to tell you without destroying everything. The document in this envelope will explain. I love you. I've always loved you. Edward. My heart was pounding. What could he possibly have been hiding? Affair, debt, a secret I couldn't even imagine? I unfolded the document. It was a paternity test, dated 25 years ago before Edward and I had even met. Edward Johnson is not the biological father of Benjamin Carter. I read it again and again and again, not the biological father. Ben wasn't Edward's son. Ben, who looked so much like Edward, same dark hair, same smile, same mannerisms. Ben, who Edward had raised, who he'd claimed, who he'd put first always. Not his biological child. My mind spun. If Edward wasn't Ben's father, whose son was he? And why had Edward lied? Why had he taken on responsibility for a child that wasn't his? I sat on the floor of Edward's office for hours, that paper in my hands, trying to make sense of it. Everything I thought I knew was wrong. Edward hadn't been betrayed by Ben's mother walking away from their child. Edward had known from the beginning that Ben wasn't his. Had done the paternity test, gotten the results, and still chosen to raise him. But why? And why lie to me about it? Why let me believe for 22 years that Ben was Edward's biological son? What else had Edward been hiding? I called the hospital listed on the test the next day. It took hours to get through to someone who could help me. I'm trying to verify a paternity test from 25 years ago. The woman on the phone was kind but firm. That's quite old. Let me see what I can find. She put me on hold, music played, I stared at the wall numb. Finally, she came back. Yes, I have the record here. The test was processed in 1999. Edward Johnson was tested against the infant Benjamin Carter. Results showed no biological relationship. Is there something specific you need? No, I said quietly. That's all I needed to know. I hung up. It was real. The test was real. Edward had known for 25 years that Ben wasn't his son, and he'd never told me. I felt betrayed, confused, angry, and heartbroken, not just for myself, but for Ben. What was I supposed to tell him? That the man he'd called dad his entire life, the man he'd just buried, wasn't actually his father? How do you destroy someone's entire identity like that? How do you take away the only parent they've ever really known? But I couldn't keep it from him. Ben deserved the truth. He was 22 years old, an adult, and if Edward's death had taught me anything, it was that secrets don't stay buried forever. They surface eventually, usually at the worst possible time. Better to tell him now with love and care than to let him find out some other way. So 3 days after I found the letter, I asked Ben to come home from school. I need to talk to you about something, about your dad. He looked worried. Is everything okay? Did you find debt or something? No, nothing like that. Just come home, please. He sat across from me at the kitchen table, the same table where we'd eaten thousands of meals together, where I'd helped him with homework, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays. I handed him the letter and the test results. Your dad left this for me. I found it in his safe. Ben read the letter first, his face confused. Then he unfolded the test. I watched him read it, watched his face change from confusion to shock to anger. This is a mistake, he said flatly. It has to be a mistake. I called the hospital. It's not a mistake. Mom, this is crazy. Dad would never, he wouldn't lie about this, not for my whole life. I know it's hard to. You're lying. His voice rose, cracking. You're trying to ruin his memory. You're trying to make me hate him? Ben, no, I would never. Then why are you showing me this? Why are you saying my dad isn't my dad? He stood up, knocking his chair over. I don't believe you. I don't believe any of this. And he left, just walked out, slamming the door behind him. I sat there alone in the kitchen, the test results on the table, feeling like the worst person in the world. I had become the villain in my son's eyes, not because I lied, but because I told the truth. Grace found me there an hour later, crying. She'd heard Ben leave, heard the door slam. What happened? I showed her the letter, the test. She read it carefully, her face serious. When she finished, she looked at me. What are you going to do? I don't know, I need to understand. Why would Edward do this? Why would he take on someone else's child and never tell me the truth? Maybe, Grace said slowly, there's more to the story. Maybe you need to find out who Ben's real father is and why Dad was raising him. She was right. I needed answers. I needed to understand the full story before I could make sense of any of this. I went back through Edward's papers looking for anything about Ben's early life. Birth certificate, medical records, anything, and I found photos. Old ones from before Edward and I met. Photos of Edward with a woman, beautiful, dark-haired, laughing. Photos of the same woman pregnant. Photos of Edward holding a newborn baby. On the back of one photo, written in Edward's handwriting, Laura and Ben 3 days old. Laura, Ben's mother. The woman Edward said had abandoned them? I found more documents. A death certificate for Laura Marie Carter, dated 6 months after Ben was born. Cause of death, complications from childbirth. My heart stopped. She hadn't abandoned Ben. She'd died. Why had Edward told me she'd walked away? Why lie about that? I kept digging, found letters, old emails printed out and saved. And slowly, piece by piece, the truth started to emerge. Edward and Laura had dated in their early 20s. They broke up, apparently not on good terms. A year later, Laura contacted Edward. She was pregnant. She'd been with someone else after they broke up, but that relationship ended when she found out she was pregnant. The father wanted nothing to do with her or the baby. Laura was scared, alone. She reached out to Edward not because she thought he was the father, but because she needed help. And Edward, being Edward, helped. He was there when Ben was born. He supported Laura financially. And when complications arose during birth, when Laura died on the operating table, Edward was the only person there. The only person who could take the baby. So he did, but he didn't know if Ben was his. The timeline was close. They'd broken up just a few months before Laura got pregnant. Edward could have been the father, or it could have been the other man. So Edward did a paternity test. And when the results came back negative, when he found out Ben wasn't his biological son, he had a choice to make. Give Ben up for adoption, let him go into the foster system, or keep him, claim him as his own, raise him as if he were his biological child. Edward chose to keep him. He chose love over biology. He chose to be Ben's father even though he didn't have to be, but he never told me. When we met, when he introduced me to Ben, he let me believe Ben was his biological son. Maybe he thought I wouldn't stay if I knew the truth. Maybe he thought it didn't matter. Maybe he was afraid I'd see Ben differently, love him less. I don't know, I'll never know now. All I know is that Edward raised a child who wasn't his, loved him completely, and died keeping that secret. I found Laura's sister's contact information in Edward's papers. Martha Carter, still living in the same town. I called her, my heart pounding. Mrs. Carter, my name is Julia Johnson. I was married to Edward Johnson. Silence, then, oh my God, I heard about his death. I'm so sorry. Thank you, I'm calling because I found some documents about your sister Laura and her son Ben. Another pause. What do you want to know? Everything. I need to know everything. We met at a coffee shop. Martha was in her 60s, kind-faced, sad-eyed. She told me about Laura. About how she'd been young and scared when she got pregnant. About how the father had abandoned her. About how Edward had stepped up even though he didn't have to. Edward loved my sister, Martha said. Not romantically, not anymore, but as a friend, as a human being who needed help. And when she died, when Ben had no one, Edward didn't hesitate. He took him, raised him. I offered to help, but Edward said he could handle it. Said Ben was his responsibility now. Did you know Edward wasn't Ben's biological father? I asked. Martha looked down at her coffee. Yes, Edward told me after the test. He said he was going to raise Ben anyway, that it didn't matter whose biology he had, that what mattered was who showed up. Why didn't Edward tell me? My voice broke. Why did he let me believe Ben was his? Martha looked at me with such compassion. Because he was afraid, Julia, afraid you'd leave. Afraid you wouldn't want to raise another woman's child with another man's genetics. By the time he realized you loved Ben just for being Ben, it was too late to tell you without seeming like a liar, which I suppose he was, but his lie came from love, not malice. I wanted to be angry, wanted to rage at Edward for lying, for keeping this from me. But sitting there with Martha, hearing the full story, all I felt was sadness. Sadness for Edward, who'd carried this secret alone for so long. Sadness for Ben, whose entire identity was built on a foundation that wasn't what he thought it was. There's something else, Martha said quietly. Something I think you need to know. My heart clenched. What? Do you remember when you gave birth to your first baby? Before Grace? I froze. I had a stillbirth. Before Ben, before Edward and I got married. The baby was premature. He didn't make it. Martha reached across the table and took my hand. Yeah, there was a mix-up at the hospital that night. Two babies born around the same time. Yours and Laura's. The medical staff made a terrible mistake. Your baby survived. Laura's didn't, but they gave you Laura's baby, the one who had died, and they gave Laura your baby, your son, Ben. The world stopped. Everything went silent. I couldn't breathe. What? Edward found out years later, after Laura died. He was going through her medical records, trying to get information for Ben's pediatrician. And he found documents that didn't match up. He investigated, and he discovered the truth. Ben is your biological son, Julia. He always was. You gave birth to him, you just didn't know it. I pulled my hand away, stood up, backed away from the table. No, that's not possible. I buried my baby. I grieved. I know, I'm so sorry, but it's true. Edward knew. He'd planned to tell you, but then he died. I left the coffee shop in a daze, drove home not remembering the drive. Sat in my driveway for an hour trying to process what Martha had told me. Ben was mine, my son, my biological child that I'd thought was dead. I'd mourned him for months. Years, really. And all that time he was alive, growing up, being raised by Edward, and then being raised by me once Edward and I got together. I'd spent 20 years raising my own son without knowing he was mine. The cruelty of it, the impossible, bizarre cruelty? I called the hospital, demanded records. It took weeks, lawyers, threats of lawsuits, but eventually they admitted it. There had been a mix-up 25 years ago, two babies, mine and Laura's. The staff had been overwhelmed, understaffed. They'd made a mistake, given the wrong babies to the wrong mothers. By the time anyone realized, Laura was dead and Edward had custody of Ben. The hospital had tried to contact Edward, but he'd moved, changed his number. They'd let it drop, afraid of the lawsuit, the publicity. They'd let me go on believing my son was dead when he was alive. Ben had to tell him the truth, the whole truth this time. I called him. He hadn't spoken to me since I'd shown him the paternity test. Ben, please, I need to see you. There's more to the story. He came reluctantly, sat across from me at that same kitchen table. I showed him everything. The hospital documents, Martha's testimony, the full timeline. You're not Edward's biological son, I said. But you're mine. The hospital made a mistake when you were born. They gave me the wrong baby, a baby who had died. And they gave your birth mother my baby. Edward found out years later. He was going to tell us, but he died before he could. Ben stared at me, didn't speak for a long time. When he finally did, his voice was small, broken. So all this time I wasn't your stepson? No, sweetheart, you were my son. You always were. From the moment you were born, I just didn't know it. He started crying. Deep, wrenching sobs. I went to him, pulled him into my arms the way I had when he was little. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry for all the lies and confusion. I'm sorry Edward didn't tell us. But Ben, you need to know you were loved, so loved, by Edward, who chose you even when he didn't have to. And by me, who loved you before I even knew you were mine. We held each other and cried, for Edward, for the years of secrets. For the truth that was both devastating and somehow healing. Ben looked at me, his eyes red. Does this change anything between us? No, I said firmly. You're my son, you've always been my son. Biology just confirmed what I've known in my heart for 20 years. He hugged me again, tighter. I love you, Mom. I love you too, baby, so much. The next few months were hard. Ben went to therapy to process everything. So we had to grieve? Not just for Edward, but for the deception, for the lost years, for the truth that came too late. Grace was amazing through all of it, supportive and steady. She and Ben grew closer, realizing they were full siblings, not half. The family Edward had tried to create through secrets had become real in a way he never could have imagined. I went to Edward's grave often, stood there looking at his headstone, trying to understand the man I'd been married to for 22 years. He'd been good and flawed and complicated. He'd lied to me, yes, but he'd also protected me, loved me, given me back my son in the only way he knew how. I couldn't decide if I should be angry or grateful, so I chose both. I chose to hold space for the complexity of what Edward had done, the cruelty of his deception, and the compassion of his choice to raise Ben at all. 5 years have passed now. Ben graduated college, got a good job as an engineer. He's engaged to a wonderful woman who knows the whole story and loves him anyway. At family dinners, we tell stories about Edward, the good and the complicated. We've stopped pretending he was perfect. We've started accepting that he was human, that he made choices based on fear and love in equal measure. And we've chosen to forgive him because what's the alternative? Staying angry at a dead man who can't defend himself. That helps no one? I think about that paternity test sometimes. About how a single piece of paper appended everything I thought I knew. But I also think about what came after, the truth that Ben was mine had always been mine. And I realized that Edward's greatest lie contained his greatest gift. He gave me my son back without me ever knowing I'd lost him. He let me raise my own child, love him, bond with him, all while protecting me from the grief of knowing what had been stolen from us. Was that right? I don't know, probably not, but it was done with love. Everything Edward did was done with love, even when it was misguided. Life has a cruel way of hiding truth behind mercy. My husband's lie wasn't born from betrayal, it was born from fear. Fear that I wouldn't stay. Fear that I wouldn't love a child who wasn't biologically his or mine. Fear that the truth would destroy what we'd built. And maybe he was right to be afraid, or maybe he underestimated me. I'll never know. All I know is that love doesn't need DNA. It only needs a heart that never stops believing. It needs showing up, staying, choosing someone every day regardless of biology. Edward did that, I did that, and Ben was loved completely by people who chose him even when they didn't have to. I have a photo on my mantle now. Me, Ben, Grace, Edward's not in it, it was taken after he died. But he's there in Ben's smile, in the values he taught both our children, in the family he built through impossible choices. People ask sometimes if I'm angry at Edward for lying. And I tell them the truth, I'm sad, I'm confused. I wish he'd trusted me with the truth earlier. But I'm not angry. Because in the end, his lie gave me the one thing I'd thought I'd lost forever, my son. And I can't be angry about that. I can only be grateful.